It's now my pleasure to call on Professor Ivor Chipkin, who is the director of a government and public policy think tank, and he will address us on social compacts and new social contract. Here he is. Please welcome Ivor Chipkin.
So, it's a great pleasure to be here. Kgalema Motlanthe, President Motlanthe, thank you very much for having me. I promised Nick that I'll be as short as a Liz Truss prime ministership. So let's see how we go. I've been asked to speak around on the conditions of a social compact in South Africa. And I want to use the opportunity to think around the notion of a social compact and more broadly to think around the state of South Africa today. So in my mind, when I hear social compact, an older term is evoked, that is of corporatism. And essentially what we're discussing in South Africa, the conditions of a social compact, are the conditions of bringing labor, business and government together to establish some kind of developmental compact which will allow the conditions of economic growth, some form of redistribution and political stability. And we can discuss those conditions, and I think that tends to be the framework in which much of our conversation continues to happen in South Africa. My concern about that conversation, though, is that it's premised on an idea of political elites, of the entities that must be brought together in a social compact, that is way too narrow and that misunderstands our particular history. The elites in South Africa are not those simply from business, from labor, and from government. There are other elites in South Africa which we obscure in that kind of analysis. I don't want to get into the details here, I've only got a few minutes. But think of the homelands. By the end of the apartheid period, for example, South Africa had been fragmented fundamentally into 6 nominally independent states and a whole range of self-governing territories. Each had their own public service. We remember, for example, that what brings down Botswana is a massive public service strike. Organized public service unions, police forces, their own militaries in this regard, a whole host of politicians. These are all elite groups which somehow play a role in post-apartheid South Africa. So when we think of social compacting simply as a relationship between business, labor, and government, we obscure a view of all these other kinds of political elites. I think these other elites are absolutely fundamental to our future, and helping to understand what they're doing and where they're going helps us understand the character or the nature of the precipice of which we're in now. So I want to draw a term which comes from new work by a Chinese scholar. His name is Yahua Wang, and for a short advert, I'll be in discussion with him on the 8th of December. He's just written a book called The Rise and Fall of Imperial China. And what's impressive about that piece of work and what is useful for our own in terms of analysis is it introduces a paradox, what he calls the sovereign's dilemma. And this is how he describes Chinese history over the last 2,000 years. And you'll forgive me, I'll do this very quickly. 2,000 years of Chinese history in 30 seconds. Essentially, he argues this, is that Chinese history can be understood as a vacillation between strong states and weak states. Strong states, though, that are very short-lived, and very, very weak states that are strong, that have a long tenure. And the dilemma is this: those emperors, those central states that are able to dominate local and regional elites, of those states that are able to build powerful central state administrations that deliver growth and prosperity. But that domination of regional and local elites comes at a high political cost, because those local and regional elites resist the center. They do their best to establish their local autonomy and redirect resources into regional programs and for regional populations. As a result, strong states are short-lived because regional elites are powerful and they resist. Weak emperors are states that essentially concede tremendous power to regional and local elites, so that those centralized administrations that are responsible for high levels of growth and development never begin to emerge. I think that analysis, or those terms of analysis, are useful for thinking about South Africa. You have, for example, in the period of Mbeki, and there are all sorts of qualifiers to Mbeki's period, but nonetheless, one of the key figures is the attempt to shift power away from Luthuli House into the presidency, but also a large-scale movement of building powerful, centralized state institutions that are capable of doing things. We know a couple of them. National Treasury is one of the great achievements of the Mbeki period. So is the South African Revenue Services. There are many other such institutions of large-scale state building at the center. I think what emerges, though, and this is what I think Polokwane represents, is a huge strike back from regional and local elites. When I did a whole lot of ethnographic work and a whole lot of sociological plotting, some quite boring but painstaking work of seeing the change in the composition of the South African cabinet since 1994, what was astonishing about the Zuma period is the rise into very senior very senior positions in government and in politics of people that have no history of national responsibility, but come from very regional or local organizations into very, very senior positions in government and the cabinet itself. If you like, this is South Africa's sovereign dilemma, an attempt to produce high-level state capacity which could deliver growth and prosperity in South Africa challenges and threatens local and regional elites who then resist, and this is what I think we saw in Polokwane, the resistance of regional and local elites. I think if that analysis is correct, then, and this is where I want to come to an end, Nick, I think we face a profound dilemma today. We have an opportunity of continuing on the path of trying to build centralized state administrations, and this is my answer to BC Jonas's question. Why, if it's so obvious to build administrations, why are we not doing it? And I think the reason is this. We are trying to do we've been trying to do that for 20 years with some success. It hits massive resistance from 2009. We haven't overcome that resistance. What we're facing is massive concerted resistance from regional and local elites. I think our options now are this, is to continue on that path. I must be honest, I think the risks are very, very high that this is going to provoke civil war in South Africa. So I do think that precipice is very, very imminent. And the risks are very, very high in that regard. The alternative, though, it seems to me, and this is what I want to put on the table here, very controversially perhaps, is to make concessions to regional and local elites through some politics of decentralization or devolution of power. There also has great risks because in some cases those regional and local elites are demagogues, they're warlords, they're certainly not committed to the democratic practice, and some of them are straightforward mafia bosses involved in criminal syndicates. So there's a great danger that decentralization and devolution supports and strengthens a whole lot of, quite frankly, terrifying and dangerous forces at local level. I think there's a way of dealing with it, though, because that is not the entire picture. In many cases, in some of those cases, those local and regional elites are prepared or able to be corralled into the framework of South Africa's democratic dispensation. And this is where I'd like to end. I think the way forward is a process of slow, deliberate, careful decentralization and devolution of power, on condition, though, that those to whom power is devolved commit very firmly to the principles of South Africa's constitutional democracy and agree to play by the rules of South Africa's democratic game. It seems to me that this is the way out of South Africa's sovereign dilemma and seems to me potentially a path of re-establishing South Africa's trajectory of growth and prosperity for everyone. On that note, I end. Thank you very much.